First of all, welcome everybody here. And secondly, just to talk very briefly about just a few of the milestones that brought us here tonight. Something I was really excited to do because, in part because A, I grew up on the north side, and B, my father was a resident of the St. John's community. And so I grew up hearing stories about that community.
North side. Everyone's look around to the north side of Flint. Okay, how many of you kind of your grandparents just love the north? You love the north side of Flint. You love it. You love it. Okay, so today, Naira, activist, Brittany Ward, advertising marketing, yes. Shaquille Green, principal, Brittany Reed, phenomenal director, right? Quay, nursing, the Aubrey, playwright, Kanisha, engineering, John Mateen wants to be a health administrator, Alexis Harvey, playwright, French,
Everything. North side of Flint, Michigan. It's bound on the north by Carpenter, and then on the south by Pearson Road, and then on the east by York Highway, and the west by Saginaw Street. These lines, these boundaries, contain within them a depth of historical dualism, holding both a sense of belonging and overwhelming isolation.
Of racial hatred and racial guilt.
Classism and economic cooperation.
Jim Crow housing and open housing.
Government assistance and civic abandonment.
Tremendous economic shifts, broken dreams, and underlying hopes. As much as we may be tempted to define the North Side in strictly geographical terms, it is as much about the pulse of communities as it is about the streets that contain them. Being born in the late 80s, I grew up completely ignorant about the many shifts and transitions that had come to Flint's North Side before my arrival. I remember the North Side as being an all-black community since I was born. However, according to Mr. Norm Bryant,
we have white neighbors because we are all mixed up in there. We have Polish and Romanian, some Hungarians and Italians. We are all over there together.
Speaking about the same time period, Ms. Sandra Epps and Mr. Laverne Ross described their neighborhood in much the same way, saying,
Well, the neighborhood that I was born in on Pasadena Street was racially diverse. There were Italians, there were Polish, African Americans. I started school at Parkland, which was mixed.
When my family bought the house on Parkland, that was predominantly a white neighborhood, and I think that we were the first black family on that street. So kids ate at my house, and I ate at theirs.
Basically, the north side of Flint that I grew up in was pretty much mixed.
according to many, a lot of the racial diversity on the North Side during the early to mid-20th century was largely a result of economic trends created by the hiring practices of General Motors and the various industries and businesses that sprung up to support GM's thousands of employees. According to one resident, Janet Felton,
we were friends with all kinds of people, to Hungarians, to Mexicans, all kinds of races mixed together. Some got jobs as teachers and whatever, but mainly I think the jobs were at General Motors because that was a big salary. So most everybody would leave their professional jobs and work for GM as an hourly worker, you know, to get more money, even though the job was not exciting.
one could argue that GM built the North Side of Flint. As former Flint mayor and state house member Woodrow Stanley recalls,
it's the same story for most folks that settle in Chicago or Cleveland or Flint or wherever. They were drawn here by the factories, and it was always a family connection.
however, Flint's North Side was not without its racial tensions.
You have blacks and Polish staying in the same area. They have their own bar and stuff. I remember a black dude. He went into the bar next to Taylor's store, which was black owned, but it was a Polish bar. They threw him out of there because he's black. But if you're Polish, you'll be all right, see? So we encounter that within our own community because we are mixed up there, you see?
On top of tensions with the racially diverse community, black residents of Flint lived under racially segregated housing up to the passage of the Open Housing Ordinance in the mid-1960s.
I think everybody basically was in the same bag. We were forced to live in a city within a city. We could not, as African Americans, move west of Saginaw or east of the Flint River. So everybody in the community was pretty much on equal basis. We had professionals in there too. We had teachers that lived in that area. Everybody was African American.
Max Brandon, who grew up in the Industrial Street community, explained,
People looked out for you, and they would say, you can't go across Saginaw Street, you gotta stay on this side. Letting you know you weren't wanted across in that area. That's what we did. We stayed close to Burston and all down through there.
Housing in my community was mixed, but they were kind of racially divided. There was kind of like a line, we were kind of confined. We
then I moved west of Saginaw Street.
There were folks that had financial means to live elsewhere, but we were a segregated community by law because open occupancy was not passed until 64 or 65, or somewhere in that neighborhood. The fact of the matter is that they were constricted by law to live in that neighborhood.
The Flint Journal did its part to support the racial segregation that existed in Flint at that time, too.
Back in those days, black folks didn't even buy a home. They had in the Flint Journal newspaper, says color, and that's where you had to buy. So what they did is they grouped us together. So therefore, the reason we had segregated schools in Flint is because of neighborhood patterns.
When I was a child and went to look for jobs, the Flint Journal, it would be right there in the paper, white only. Oh yeah, it would be white only. It wasn't hidden.
But under the weight of housing and occupational racism, residents of the north side of Flint came to define themselves by not only surviving, but socially and economically thriving. There were thriving African-American businesses as well as thriving Caucasian businesses. George Frawley was a very prominent African-American businessman who owned a Coney Island on the corner of Leith and Industrial. He was one of the first African-Americans, along with my father's father, who built a home on the south end of Flint in what we used to call Sugar Hill, the Shalom Street and Phil Street area. You also had people like the parents of Dr. Reaver who owned a dry cleaners on Industrial. I compare American businesses now to those days, and I say to myself, my goodness. To some extent, we had more African-American businesses back then than we have now, more thriving.
Flint back in those days, black people owned things. You had little side stores, and I'll never forget on Hickory Street, a gentleman, the Moors, he had a store. Blacks had all kinds of businesses, whether it was in food business or grocery store. Many blacks had all kinds of businesses.
You had to have black businesses because we were segregated. On the industrial side, they were black. St. John Street was black, and business on the south side was black. We had a lot of chicken markets, fish markets, grocery stores. Alfred's grocery store over on Mott and St. John. The wallpaper and paint store, we had the Hut, we had Unique. These are clubs. We had RG and you had Elks. Al's Shoe Sign Parlor. We had all kinds of stuff, man.
I always make the point that there were African-American owned businesses during that time that I was growing up in Flint. During the period that we were segregated and we were looking for progress, and there is now, and we were supposedly have arrived at the amount of progress. African-American owned cleaners, restaurants, except for new clothing, everything was contained right in the neighborhood.
Barbershops, everything. Restaurants, clubs, doctors, record shops. At Burston, you played ball, softball, you had games, you had everything. You had shows, theaters, and stuff. The North End was set up in such a way that I used to tell people, they used to laugh at me. I was almost a grown man before I got downtown to buy something, because I didn't have to go downtown.
While the north side of Flint had plenty of legitimate small businesses to supply the needs of its citizens, it also garnered a reputation for being home to its share of illicit industries.
Take, for instance, prostitution. They were centered around Buick because that's where your money source was. Gambling, the bars, and everything. You had blacks and whites frequenting the after-hour joints or the prostitutes. And this is where it all was, around the money.
People of all colors, all classes, and from all parts of town came to support the North Side's thriving underground economy. The proximity of these neighborhoods to factories made them a perfect location to catch people fresh off work with money in their pocket and looking for a variety of pleasures and distractions. The North Side may have developed a reputation as a seedy place to be at night, but apparently it was a seedy place that people from all over Flint were all too ready to visit and spend money supporting.
I used to peddle the newspaper, the Free Press, my brother and I. My route was from Carter Street to Lee, and from Industrial to Saginaw. We had the whole big area there, you see, and we had to peddle papers on Sunday morning because that's where the funny papers came out. And there was many a times I had white guys that had been up all Saturday night, Sunday morning, running around saying, "Hey kid, tell me where a black woman is."
I do know that one place I live, next door. He was running numbers. There's an insurance man that would come by the house and collect the insurance payment. And being so naive, I thought the insurance and number guy were probably the same kind of people because I see them out there going here and there. And then our house, you know, that guy came and got $2 a month, and we thought, okay. So I thought the rest of them must be out there collecting insurance too.
General Motors particularly played multiple roles in the creation, rise, and demise of Flint's North Side. Most manufacturing jobs in the Midwest were initially filled by people of European descent. However, as manufacturing continued to grow, blacks eventually came to be hired. Hundreds of thousands of African Americans moved from the South to cities all across the Midwest, including Gary, Indiana, Chicago, Illinois, Detroit, and of course, Flint, Michigan. At first, blacks were only hired to do menial tasks. Janet Felton remembered how her father began working at the plant. When I asked if it was easy for him to get in, she replied,
I don't know. One of the things I do know is that the black man, which wasn't called black back then, it was Negro, colored. I do know that they gave them the worst jobs. Most of the black men were only allowed to work in the foundry. You didn't know who was white and who was black, and everybody came out dark and covered in soot.
African-American employees, at least that work for General Motors here in Flint, worked in the foundry, which is the worst job from a health standpoint, a working condition standpoint.
There was just as many Southern white folks coming up as black folks. And when they came here, they didn't leave their prejudice behind them. They brought it with them. They didn't leave their dislike of black folks down there. They brought it with them. So when you go into General Motors, if they make a white man that has a prejudice added to a foreman, and you got to work down there, what's your chances? And then you go right across the street to the UAW, and they make one of them the president of the union.
the combination of industry and urban